Hello and welcome to Reddit Roast 59. We're up to recording on a Thursday for a change. Just busy client schedule tomorrow, so I thought we'd get ahead of the curve. Mal, nice to see you again. How you doing?
Good to see you, Sam. I'm well. How are you?
All good. Who have we got today then?
Today, we have a banker who's finished a rotation program and wants to transition from a treasury role to a client-facing role. We've got a creative applicant who's wondering whether schools will look down on this or whether it makes their profile unique. We've got a Frenchie with a perfect GRE verbal score. It's not something we see every day. We've also got a LatAm applicant from Mexico aiming for a Spanish B school, which is pretty common, but we'll see if his profile is up to it. We've
Mhm.
also got a Pakistani applicant who lost a parent during undergrad, and we'll see how to approach that in the application as well. And there's also a bonus question. And are schools filtering out assholes? We'll see about that. So do you want to get started with profile one then?
Yeah, let's dive into profile one. IB or bust?
IB or bust. Looking for advice on which schools to target if my only goal is to break into IB as a domestic candidate. I'm group agnostic, but LEFIN and FIG may align well with my background. Location-wise, both Southeast and NYC, but the Southeast feels like a slightly better cultural fit. 4 years of work experience at a bulge bracket bank in Treasury with one promotion after 1.5 years, 325 GRE. 3.9 GPA on my degree, but 3.76 including freshman year. Was also a D1, D3 athlete at one SUNY and one NYC private school. Extracurriculars, student athlete career coaching program at the university at the undergrad. Joined board of local youth sports nonprofit, recreationally bodybuild, soccer referee, and tons of volunteering hours through my bank.
Hmm.
Quite short there. Sam, what do you think?
Short and sweet, very clear goals. All right, let's dive in. So, I'm going to come at this from an MBA admissions perspective, but for those who don't know, I did work in investment banking myself as well. Went through a rotation program. Was involved in equity derivatives trading mainly, um, and so I'm going to comment on sort of those goals and really keep the IB focus here. So, academically first. The 3.9 GPA and the 3.76, including freshman year. So it's the degree GPA that they will care about, mainly assuming that's the one that's shown like in bold at the bottom of the transcript. But either way, this is a really strong GPA and a really good start from an academic perspective, for sure. The 325 is okay. It's not outstanding. The I did a quick search. The Wharton average is a Q163 and verbal 162, Q163, verbal 162, I think. So kind of in and around the average, but lower quant score, which is arguably the one that carries a little bit more weight, just meh is the GRE at the moment. Especially for a mother tongue English applicant. It's like you kind of the verbal score is expected to be pretty high. 325 is not ideal, not great. From a professional perspective, quite a nice profile here. The 4 years at matriculation of work experience is a nice amount of work, like in terms of time, in terms of length, that's really nice. At a bulge bracket, in other words, a Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, a top investment bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, where I did my rotation, in a treasury role. In other words, not a classic investment banking client facing front office role, but rather a treasury helping the company manage their capital. Within a bank, it's quite an interesting role, but it's not the sexy front office role. With a promotion after 1.5 years, pretty standard promotion schedule, I think, in there. So professionally solid. Again, nothing exceptional, but solid. Demographic. I don't know anything more than like just domestic US.
Hmm.
If it's a white man working in banking, obviously difficult to stand out in that regard. But if underrepresented, potentially an angle there, the beneficial angle. Not sure. Can't be certain. Extracurriculars strong, really nice here, both from a undergrad perspective. Now, everybody has undergrad extracurriculars, so I don't place too much weight on that. But the more recent stuff, this joined the board of a local youth sports nonprofit, that is really interesting. There are not many finance applicants that have such strong extracurriculars. We really often see finance applicants who are, busy busting their ass for like, a 90-hour week, and they don't have time for extracurriculars, so they just kind of leave it out, ignore it, and that's a mistake. This candidate has a very strong extracurricular profile that shows the community involvement, etc. So I like it a lot from an extracurricular perspective. That's nice. And then the goals, this idea of pivoting from a treasury role to a front office, specifically leveraged finance, or FIG stands for fixed income group, which basically means bonds, debt, is a very logical reason for needing an MBA. It also helps narrow down the schools. Now, we'll get to this, but basically, before we do that, overall, a decent looking profile. Personally, I'm
Mm.
not seeing like Harvard and Stanford specialness to it. There's often something unique and really nice that makes me think, maybe there's a Harvard Stanford potential there. I'm not seeing it here, but the solid kind of checklist and the foundations are in place for an M7 application, I think is reasonable. Um, a few things OP can do to kind of increase those odds, but yeah, that's my kind of overview.
Um, about those schools, which schools do you think specifically are best
Hmm.
for IB for this applicant?
Yeah, I the schools that really stand out, there's no surprises here, are schools that have got very strong branding in finance. The classic one everyone talks about is Wharton.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, they've had a large cohort of finance people, and they're maybe moving away from that a little bit, trying to diversify the cohort, but it's still like legacy or the alumni, whatever. Wharton's super strong. Columbia, for obvious reasons, it's in New York City. It's right there by Wall Street. It has Wall Street pedigree. It's fantastic for investment banking. We know that. Ditto NYU Stern. From a kind of, I guess, reputational perspective, NYU Stern is perhaps slightly lower. It's not considered M7, although its admit rate is actually lower than some of the other M7s. So don't make the mistake of thinking NYU is like a safety. It's super competitive. Loads of people want to be in New York. But obviously, that New York positioning does give you access to a massive NYC Wall Street investment banking network, which helps a lot with recruiting. Finally, there's a couple of other kind of curveballs in here. The one that really stands out for me is Cornell Johnson. Cornell
Mm.
Johnson is Ivy League, but not M7. And because it's not in the middle of New York, it's like a 4 hour bus ride into New York. You can go for like a weekend, but you can't
Mm.
go in easily like for the evening. It doesn't really work. But they do have a really established pipeline with the bulge bracket investment banks and with the investment banks. So, and also more achievable in terms of lower ranking. But I would also say maybe with a good GRE score, maybe a scholarship play from a like merit scholarship perspective. OP's profile is too generic to really expect much of a scholarship from an M7. But if you start playing in the sort of the NYU Sterns and the Cornells of the world, maybe a merit scholarship's on the line there. I had a quick look at the comments as well. I'll highlight this. This is what ChatGPT says if you ask. Is literally I just tested it. It's verbatim what ChatGPT says. Um, I would, and I'm kind of aligned for the first few. Booth, by
Mm.
the way, is an interesting one. Booth is finance heavy, but it's a different sort of finance. So just to go off on a bit of a tangent here, Chicago, being in the middle of the US, is geographically halfway between the East Coast and the West Coast. And so historically, it was a trading hub, particularly commodity trading hub in the US. Now, what that evolved into is kind of the extension of what trading looks like now, which is called quant finance. Booth and Chicago more generally is an outstanding quant finance hub. That basically means like algorithmic trading. I used to work in this. After my investment banking days, I spent some time doing this. It's well paid. It's very quantity, but it's not investment banking. And there's a slight nuance difference there. If that attracts, if that kind of area of quant finance is attractive, add Booth into the mix for sure. If it's not, be very aware of that difference. And I think obviously OP has got like location preferences and is maybe not particularly interested in the Midwest. But bear that in mind. So this kind of booth recommendation is coming off the back of that, but there's a nuanced one. Um, Duke, it's not an obvious investment banking in New York fit. Darden neither. UNC neither. These schools do place people into investment banking, but it tends to be like regional hub investment banking rather than the New York City really sexy stuff. So that's the schools question. I would my kind of nuanced take on this is like round one, apply to the really obvious
Mm-hmm.
finance schools. If you don't have any luck, then maybe you start thinking a bit further afield and start looking at the UNCs and Dardens of the world.
Okay. And what do you think that OP can do to boost their chances?
Yeah, I have a few ideas that I prepared earlier. Um, the first thing is from a career perspective, to show the schools that you're serious about making this career pivot. You're in a way in quite a luxurious advantaged position in that you're a couple of doors away from the trading floor, from the investment bankers, etc., and therefore networking with those bankers ought to be easier, certainly easier than somebody who's working at like Deloitte in due diligence, for example. So the networking and starting to lay the ground for the career pivot will be super important. So that's one thing. I wonder if within your job, there are some slightly more either client facing or kind of valuation focused IB-ish tasks that you can take on. Um, I say client facing because that's, when front office is kind of known for being client facing. As a investment banker doing M&A, you would go and see the client and pitch to the client. As a trader working in the global markets business, you would be on the whether that could be like this fixed income group, for example. That could be, speaking to the traders at hedge funds and doing deals with them. Either way, you're client facing. I wonder if there's any client-facing activities you can get involved with from a treasury perspective. I'm not sure. I never worked in treasury, but there might be some. The other is from a valuation perspective. So, just sort of very lazy summary of what a treasury role looks like is you're basically managing the bank's capital.
Hmm.
That is interacts indirectly with the traders who are trading the bank's capital. And there might be a way that in a treasury role, you can get exposure or partner or collaborate with the traders somehow. So there may be ways that you can use that to start taking on some projects that are aligned with your longer term goals. And the way that would work is you would typically in your career narrative, you would say, I work in a treasury role. On this project, I interacted with the investment bankers and I really loved the work they were doing. And now I want to pivot with an MBA to do their job. That makes perfect sense. So that's some of the things you can already start doing with your work. I would also add a couple of qualifications in there. Investment banking qualifications tend to be like CFA is the big one. The other one is there's like some slightly lighter weight certifications like the FVMA, I think the initials, that are basically like valuation courses, which is what investment bankers are doing a lot of, valuation and building models. That's one thing you can do to improve yourself is start positioning yourself for that career pivot. The other thing is the GRE. Now, I mentioned this before. As a mother tongue English applicant, a 325 it's not great. And unfortunately, you're going right up against the investment bankers who have traditionally got very high or relatively high standardized test scores. There will be somebody else out there with a similar background to yours who wants to break into investment banking who has a 328. You can almost guarantee it for the M7s. So I would also consider taking that GRE a little bit higher. And given your GPA, very strong GPA, that might even open the door to some scholarships, merit-based scholarships. So I would consider the GRE again. And then I would say from an extracurricular, I would say really milk this board seat that you've got. It's one of the key things I mentioned before. It's one of the key things differentiating this candidate from other investment banking applicants who typically, historically, don't have that much in the way of extracurriculars. This is excellent. So, is there any stuff you can do to build on this, taking up leadership experience, organizing a new initiative, a new event could be one. Any opportunity to manage people within this would be really nice. Traditionally in banks, you don't get management responsibility until you're really quite senior. So I guess OP doesn't have much in the way of management experience. The extracurricular might be a way of getting that. Um, Basically, think of this as a great opportunity to get a story for the community essays. Uh, Wharton Essay 2, for example, like how are you going to contribute to Wharton? HBS Essay 2 is a leadership story. If you haven't got any leadership from your work, you probably need it from your extracurricular. So I would say really leverage the shit out of that for the next few months. Make the most of that as an EC, and really it'll help you stand out. So that's everything I've got for OP. I think it's an interesting profile. Bit of quite a lot of upside, but I guess you could say, yeah, the foundations are there.
All right. Okay, that's covered everything. Shall we move on to our next profile for the day?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay. Took the GRE 3 of 7 first attempt, non-traditional creative profile. So OP was aiming for 320 plus, but got 307. Some background as well. OP is a design creative professional, degree from the top design school in India and the US. Worked at a major tech company, the fruit one, Apple. Both have their Cupertino HQ and their international office. Had my own startup 2 years ago, freelance creative consulting work alongside some international exposure, and is targeting top US MBA programs to pivot into brand strategy. A few questions, but first, I just want your evaluation of this profile.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because we don't have that much information. And particularly from an academic perspective, it's really hard to know without a GPA, obviously. My initial knee jerk reaction is that a 307 is not going to be enough for an M7.
Yeah.
Probably not even for a T15. So just to hit that nail on the head real quick, academically, not looking ideal. Now, if there's a like 4.0 GPA or a 3.98 GPA, maybe at a stretch, but I'm assuming not. So academically, not off to a good start. Professionally, now obviously from a brand perspective, this the fruit tech company with headquarters in Cupertino is going to be a fantastic plus for OP's profile. I worked with a client from there last year who got into HBS and MIT, and we know the schools like that brand for obvious reasons. Promotions would help. I don't know how much there is in the way of promotions. Doesn't really mention it, but just to be clear, like pretty much every applicant, any promotions you've got will be beneficial, particularly if those promotions are like above and faster than your traditional path. We don't know here. The startup, this had my own startup a couple of years ago in freelance creative consulting work. That could be positive if it's used well. If that plays into a narrative somehow, it could be interesting. Having a startup on its own isn't necessarily beneficial to the profile, but it could be if there's an interesting story in there. Now, another nuanced question I had here is, do we know if this candidate is currently employed? I'm reading between the lines, worked at, meaning no longer, had a startup, currently a creative and design professional. It might be that OP is unemployed right now. And that would be an additional complexity, not necessarily a deal breaker, but an additional complexity that we would need to overcome if that is the case. Now, from a demographic perspective, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume US, India as sort of maybe an Indian who's worked in the US, maybe an H1B, that kind of profile. Definitely ORM, right? Very, very ORM if that's the case. Extracurricular, yeah, as I said, the startup could maybe be framed as an extracurricular. The international exposure kind of helps, but I'm not seeing a huge amount in the way of extracurriculars like the board seat we roasted in the previous profile, for example. So TBD on creatives, it could be a bit of a gap. Sorry, on ECs, it could be a bit of a gap. So overall, goals, another thing. This goal of was it pivot to, yeah, pivot to brand strategy. Like that is a really logical goal. Really logical. MBA can help with it. Particularly the strategy part here. MBAs classically sets people up to think more strategically. Brand strategy is a classic post MBA role. So the goals are strong. Great work. Overall, an interesting profile here. What we often see, Mal, with these roasts is people who tick all of the boxes, but don't have that much special. What we've got here is someone who's got a very special profile, but doesn't tick any of the boxes, right?
Yeah.
Hasn't, we don't know the GPA, hasn't got the GRE done yet. Like very non-traditional in that regard. Now, that can be a positive, and we'll talk about how.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Coming to OP's questions then.
Mm.
Is this score workable for any M7s or T15s with a profile like this, or is a retake non-negotiable? If I take a retake, then I divide my time between the GRE and essays now. So I think OP is applying in round one, wants to know how to divide the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not what OP wants to hear. OP's hoping loads of people are going to say, yeah, you can still get into an M7 with a 307. It's bullshit. You
Yeah.
can't, right? That you need to retake that. And also it's June. You can't give up on testing in June. This deadlines are like 2 and a bit months away. So I'm afraid you've got to hit the books and crank that score up. It sounds like a classic case of tutoring will help. Non-traditional profile, has a first attempt in the bag, run a diagnostic with a tutor and crank that up by 10 points. It's been done before. So that's the answer to question one. And I would say even take this a step further, push to round two if you need to. I'm afraid
Mm,
you cannot apply with a 307 if you need, especially not if you're really to give yourself a credible chance at M7. If you need to, delay your application, study as long as it takes, and push yourself into round two if you have to, not round three. Don't round three is a no-no, but round two, if necessary, in other words, December deadline, if that's what it takes to crush the GRE or GRE.
mhm. Okay. And OP's next question is, do adcoms genuinely value non-traditional creative profiles, or is that just marketing talk?
Yeah, they do. They really, really do. So the context here is you need to imagine that there are industries like investment banking, previous profile, consultants, where an MBA is sort of part of the traditional growth trajectory. And so everybody in those industries is either pursuing an MBA or has thought about pursuing an MBA. There is thousands, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of applicants from those pools. Non-traditional creative profiles who come from design school, there is not many of, because an MBA is not a logical part of that that kind of trajectory. Certainly not an essential part of that trajectory. And so, if you imagine you've got a classroom and the professor's trying to talk about growth strategy, for example, then you've got a bunch of consultants bringing their frameworks and you've got a bunch of investment bankers bringing their models. The perspective from a creative person is invaluable. It's so useful for that discussion. So the schools know this, and so they genuinely are looking for people who bring that creative, unique perspective to balance out the finance nerds, the consulting nerds, to create that wider, that more interesting profile. And by the way, like other similar kind of people that diversify the investment bankers and the consultants, the military people often provide a unique perspective. The policy people provide a unique perspective. Marketing and kind of creatives are another piece of that diversification puzzle. So, yes, it really does help. And if you can nail the GRE and you've got a semi decent GPA, you are up for an M7.
Hmm. Okay. And OP's third question is, anyone here getting with a similar score or background, but I want to know from you what OP
Mm.
can do to improve their chances from like an admissions consultant perspective.
Yeah, good. I mean, to answer the question, similar background, yes. Similar score, no, is the
Hmm.
brutal answer to this. So, what can OP do to improve and hopefully get in with this background? One, GRE retake goes without saying. As a marketing person, you have some leeway on quant. They're not expecting a perfect quant score. Fine. In the way that they might be from like a investment banker, that they really are expected to push the quant average up, but not you. So that's one thing. I would also say that just to kind of target a level, honestly, I think your initial level that you were aiming for was about right for an M7, for maybe a decent shot at T15 as well. 320 is kind of floor there, realistically. Maybe like high teens, 318, 319, those kinds of numbers, but leaning towards quant. But yeah, that's where the jury needs to be. So that's the first thing OP can do to improve. Second, this question about being unemployed, going to be a thing. If
Mm,
OP, if I'm, my guess is right and you are unemployed, that's not necessarily a deal breaker. People get into MBAs unemployed all the time, but you can't skirt around this and hope they won't notice. It's their job to read applications. They will figure it out, especially with all the background checks, etc. They'll figure it out. So be direct, be honest, be transparent, and be positive about this. If I'm right, if it is. So typically that what that would look like in an optional essay, and all schools give you the chance to write an optional essay, you would say what happened. Okay. Were you laid off with your whole team, for example, in which case it's not such a big deal. You'd ask your recommender to back it up and say the same thing. So for you to say I was laid off with 5 other people when my team was closed, and the recommender says in the extra question at the end, the applicant was laid off in a like wide-ranging redundancy part of wide-ranging redundancy program, and you've got both perspectives. That's strong.
mm,
And then the other thing is in your optional essay, explain how you've made the most of it, and how you've grown, and how you've learned and developed this. For example, you could say, I was made redundant, and when my company closed my team that I was part of, and I've used the opportunity to get some AI training, and here's a boot camp thing that I've completed to polish up my Spanish, which I was already kind of learning, but I get the opportunity to strengthen, and to obviously take the GRE and get ready for business school applications. Life happens. They will not say, you're unemployed, you can't come. But they will say, you're unemployed and you're wasting your time and you're trying to hide it. That's not a good look. So that's the second thing that you can do is handle the unemployment well. Third thing, going out on a bit of a slightly more exotic tangent here, which is this freelance creative consulting work. This might be what OP's doing right now, not unemployed, but doing a bit of freelance stuff on the side to kind of
yeah,
pay the
that's
bills.
what I thought as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be the case. And in which case, it's carrying, it's doing extra, it's your current job, and that's extra focus from the admissions officers. An interesting thing that you can do here, freelance consultant is less powerful than founder. So I would encourage OP to think about setting up this freelance creative consulting work, framing that as founder of an LLC, adjust your LinkedIn accordingly, adjust your resume accordingly, founder, creative consulting LLC, and then
Mm,
frame yourself as a startup, as an entrepreneur, as opposed to a contractor who's just doing odd jobs to pay the bills. It's a nuanced difference, but it's much more impressive for most readers. That's the third main thing that OP can do to stand out and to, turn this non-creative profile into an admit.
okay. I think that answers every question that Ruby had. Shall
Great.
we go on to our third profile then?
Let's go.
Okay. Applying in the fall to programs and trying to optimize for scholarship potential, I don't want to pivot. This is more for networking and MBA strongly preferred jobs. Some background: 3.6 GPA from an Ivy undergrad, a double major in finance plus a humanity, 6 years of experience in energy across strategy and finance. ECs include alumni counselor for my class, finance chair for a networking organization, and some choral stuff. Consulting gigs across energy financing spectrum, mostly for one family office and a regional airport. Also working on a small teaching business that currently does about 50K per annum revenue. I think I have good chances of admissions in my target schools. I need to choose where to focus my free time in the next 2 months, the GRE or my side businesses. Targets are Stern, Fuqua, HECM, Francophone, Yale, considering CBS, Wharton, Sloan, but funding seems less likely there. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
on this?
Okay, we'll answer the question, but first let me just go through how I see this profile. So the 3.6 from an Ivy is excellent. With a double major, finance plus a humanity is really, really strong. Good. Next, The GRE score,
Give me
um,
a title. 170 verbal and 160
there we
oral.
go. A 330 is an extremely strong GRE score by any standards, but a perfect verbal score from a Frenchie is very
Hmm.
unique. Very, very unique. I don't think I've ever seen that before. That's really amazing. So, OP, it's going to be interesting to talk about this, but anyway, okay. So academically strong is what we're saying. Professional, energy, finance, M&A. It's pretty sexy stuff. It's got business school written all over it. 6 years of work experience, slightly on the higher end, particularly for the US schools, especially if that's now, and it's going to be 7 years at matriculation. That is high for the US schools in particular. It's a little bit nearer average for the INSEADs and HECs of the world. So, yeah, professionally solid. I imagine you've got the modeling skills absolutely locked down. That's really, this is going to be, there's going to be a lot of really heavy modeling work involved in this job. No, I don't know about promotions and progress. It looks like OP being in this industry for the whole 6 years has probably got some promotions in there and made good progress. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt and say yes, but just to be clear, promotions should stand out on your resume. Good. From a demographic perspective, we don't know exactly where from, but Francophone is almost by definition underrepresented. I mean, I'm not a geography expert at all, but that basically means what? France, obviously, Belgium, potentially, Montreal and Quebec and Canada, potentially, or even like parts of Africa, like Congo, whichever it is, that's going to be underrepresented for MBA for business school. So definitely, well, I think URM is my take. My perhaps if because the GPA is on a 3 point, um, is it, yeah, because it's Ivy. My guess is maybe French Canadian, but I don't know.
Hmm.
We'll see. Extracurriculars, a nice mix of undergrad and postgraduate stuff here. I get the sense that the finance chair for the networking org is more recent and the choral stuff is more recent. And maybe and the alumni counselor, that could be more recent as well because that's since graduation. So basically, really nice extracurriculars, really, really strong. This is shaping up to be a very strong profile, Mal. Finally, goals. I think there was a goal of I don't want to pivot. This is more for
Yeah, that's something
networking.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So I'm going to read this as more of the same industry.
Yeah.
Nuanced take here. OP. There's a difference between I want to go back into the same job I've been in and just do the MBA for a break versus my manager. I want to use the MBA to pivot into the same industry, but a slightly higher level role, which is a bit more logical for why you would go and do an MBA and pay up all this money. And, that career growth and ambition is something the schools are looking for and they like. So potentially a very nice goal there, but just needs to be refined. It needs so there's some nuances there to handle. So overall, excellent profile. This is it's got M7 all over it.
Hmm. Okay. And coming to OP's question
Mm.
about focusing their free time, should they do that on the side businesses or should they focus it? They have only 2 months, focus on the GRE? What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So on the one hand, the GRE is already very strong. A 330 is, I think Wharton's average is mid 320s at the moment, and a 330, sorry, yeah, 330 is really, really astonishing. They might, 160 quant is perhaps lower than you're capable of. I get that. But at the same time, the score overall is high enough and your GPA and overall is high enough that it's not an essential, resitting it is not an essential. On the other hand, if the other thing you're going to be doing is more work on the side business, I don't think the side business is going to really make that much difference in the next 2 months, right? Maybe you land another client, great. Or maybe you like, expand the revenue from, you make another 10K of revenue, fine. But the actual essence of the work and what the business is doing isn't going to change much in the next couple of months. So it doesn't seem like that's the best use of time either. So I would be my kind of decision tree is this. I would say if you feel like you can get that quant score up relatively easily, for example, you've nailed a 165 in the test in the past, in a practice test, for example, then fine, go for it. Take that test again and try and get that GRE higher, particularly the quant score higher. But if not, or after, get your focus onto the application.
Hmm.
I would rule out this more work on my side business. That's a waste of time at this point, I think. I would focus on writing an incredibly strong set of applications, really punchy essays, and getting some great letters of recommendation as well from your current manager, maybe the manager before, but like really strong and recent letters of recommendation. I think the nuanced take here is that OP seems to think he's got ages.
Hmm.
It's only like 10 weeks till deadlines. That's our typical work process. Like this is when that's the time it takes us as consultants to take a client from start to finish for like a 3 school package or so.
Hmm.
So OP, you haven't got that much time. I would say maybe take the test one more time and then get onto the essays, get onto the LORs.
Okay. And speaking of OP's goals and narrative, the energy narrative, what do you think would work best for them?
Yeah, okay. I think just one thing I want to touch on quickly on is this scholarship potential here.
Mm-hmm.
I do think you have scholarship potential. I really do. I think that all those extracurriculars and the Ivy undergrad and stuff, if you can get that GRE even any points higher, like scholarship potential, fine. Let's say mid 5 figures, definitely on the cards, 50, 80K, those kinds of numbers, definitely. And that applies for me, I'd say that applies across all the M7. Fine. And a higher quant score would definitely lean into that, definitely benefit that. So, with that in mind, let's say that the quant score is done, and let's say that OP is applying to M7. We need a narrative. And OP is going back to the same job, so the narrative is maybe not obvious. Right, let's talk about it. I would say that your focus should be on a small or sort of realistic step up in the hierarchy that you're already in. In other words, look at your bosses and kind of the people around your boss's level. Which of them have MBAs? One. Which of them are doing roles you find interesting? Because it might be your direct manager, but it might be that someone tangential to him or her is doing interesting work as well. So take that look around and figure out where you'd want to be. Think about where the skill gaps are for you to get into those roles. What are they doing that you've got no experience with? Right? So here's how a narrative would typically look, bullet point by bullet point, start to finish. Right? First, you're working on a really interesting deal, right? Some sort of M&A deal, some sort of impactful project. And you notice on that deal that somebody senior to you is doing something you find really interesting, right? Maybe it's a client-facing responsibility, like negotiating with clients. Maybe it's engaging with the regulators, right? These kinds of responsibilities that are typically handled at a more senior level. And you're looking up and you're thinking, wow, I love that. I wish I was doing that. I want an MBA to grow into that manager's title, to become that manager. I have lots of the skills I need already. I'm already in the industry. I have lots of the skills already. The modeling skills, as I mentioned earlier, modeling is probably nailed down here. A bit of a network in the industry as well. Been there 6 years. You know a few people, but you need new skills from an MBA, and this is crucial because otherwise, if you don't need an MBA for it, just go naturally, go without the MBA. So why do you need an MBA? A couple of things that might work. One, formal management training. At the moment, it looks like OP's management is like on a project basis, maybe. Doesn't look like OP has any direct reports coming into him or her. So the leadership training from an MBA will be absolutely crucial. That's one. Another one would be perhaps exposure outside of your own industry. I imagine that one of the things they look for in managers on these kinds of engagements is industry exposure beyond just this one finance M&A vertical. And that industry exposure you could get from, for example, energy classes during your MBA could be relevant here. So that industry exposure is another one. Third, negotiation training would be really valuable here. And almost all MBA programs offer really good negotiation training. And in those manager roles, I mentioned that manager that might be interfacing with regulators, negotiation is needed by them. So the negotiation class is super valuable. Maybe there's an international component to this. It sounds like OP's network, maybe in France, is strong, but not in the US, for example. And so needs that network in the US as well, and gets that from the classmates, from cohort, from alumni, etc. So those are the reasons why you need an MBA to break into the role that's just above you in the same company or industry you are already in. Very valid. And I think that, to be blunt, if OP puts that narrative together well, scores a couple of points higher on the quant, then it's probably been a bit conservative on these schools. I think M7 should be the focus. I can see why HEC and INSEAD might appeal, but really, if you're going to go to the US and take on all the debt for an MBA, and maybe with a bit of scholarship, but still it's going to be expensive, I would say shoot for MBA for M7, HBS and Stanford included.
Okay, wow. All right. So should we move on to our next profile? We've covered
Yeah.
everything for this one.
Let's do it. OP, I'd love to speak to you about that. I worked with a client last year who had a 3.6 from Yale and got into HBS, and I think there's parallels here. I'd love to work with you on it. Get in touch. Cool. Next profile then.
All right. 615 GMAT. Are these schools realistic? Long-time lurker, first-time poster.
Hello, welcome, long-time lurker.
Yeah. Profile snapshot. Age 29, nationality Mexican, underrepresented, I believe. Undergraduate bachelor's in industrial engineering from Tecnológico de Monterrey, which is a top school by ADCOMS in Mexico with a GPA of 3.6. GMAT 615, which OP says is equivalent to the 680 on the classic. Work experience, 5 years at a major American retailer, which is top 5 in the US with 4 promotions. Background, merchant commercial operator, not consulting or finance. Target schools by priority include ESA, HEC, LBS, INSEAD, Bocconi, Cambridge, ISADE, and Rockman. Few questions in there, but I would love to know your take on this profile first.
Oh, so much to get into here. Okay, good stuff. So first, 3.6 GPA from a top school in Mexico. Great start, right? That's bang on the M7 average, 3.6. So really, really good start. Schools will really like that. Industrial engineering, proper hardcore subject. They are going to like that. Now, the 615 is not so strong. I'm not sure I agree with that conversion. I was squinting a little bit at that. I make a 615 to be about a 660 on the old test, or maybe a 670 tops, but not 680. So I think that's a little bit positive. Either way, regardless, it's about 70 points below the average for M7s. It's about 40 points below the average for INSEAD and ESA. So it's not great. It's maybe a little bit of a weak point on the profile. Work experience. Now, this is where things get really interesting. This 5 years at a major American retailer, top 5 in the US with 4 promotions. This is interesting from several perspectives. One, retail can have outstanding results. Anybody listening who thinks, I don't work in consulting or finance, and therefore I can't get into an MBA, you're wrong. You're straight up wrong. The lowest GPA that I've ever seen get into Harvard was, into HBS specifically, was a retail applicant a couple of years ago that we worked with. It definitely can work. So that's the first thing. The 4 promotions is really nice as well. If there's one thing that screams best in class, it's awards and promotions. And you got 4 of them. So They're going to look at your work experience and think, yeah, you're probably pretty damn good at what you're doing. And if you can back that up with some really good essays, that's going to be a powerful case. So that's the professional. Now, demographic. Yes, as OP says, Mexican is Latin America and underrepresented to USB schools. Interestingly, not quite so much to the Spanish schools. For obvious reasons, language being the key one, as a Latin American applicant, and you're looking around the world and you're thinking, where can I go to business school? Yeah, you might want to go to the US and speak English, or you might want to go to ESA and speak Spanish slash Catalan, but mainly Spanish, which is in this case OP's mother tongue. You're not the first person to come up with that idea. In other words, ESA get a lot of applicants from Latin America. So I wouldn't say underrepresented for those schools. And that includes ESADE. And by the way, that also includes IE in Madrid, which isn't included in this list for some reason. Probably should be.
Yeah.
So that's from a demographic perspective. Extracurriculars, I don't see any mentioned. I don't think there's any in there. Maybe a gap. Maybe a gap. I've got 4 promotions, been really focused on work, sacrificed extracurriculars. It's possible. And if so, that would be a weakness for this profile. So the goal is to pivot into a management role, a general management role within industry. That makes sense. That makes really obvious sense. Think back to the original reasons why an MBA was created in the first place, why the degree exists originally was to train people in multinational kind of classic industry organizations to go from an individual contributor into a management role. That's the heritage, where the MBA comes from. And that is exactly what OP wants to do with an MBA. That makes sense. It really does. So I like the goals. So overall, a very strong profile, notwithstanding a slightly lackluster GMAT Focus Edition.
Okay. So OP's first question is my profile realistic for these schools given a non-consulting finance background? I almost never see merchant or retail P&L profiles on the sub, and I genuinely don't know how adcoms will view it.
Yeah, so there is this misconception that consulting and finance is exactly what business schools are looking for. And they do have their fair share of consultants and bankers on an MBA. But as we mentioned before in one of the earlier roasts, they're also looking for diversifiers to that. They don't just want a class full of bankers. How boring would that be, right? That's why they have military people. That's why they have policymakers. That's why they have marketers. That's why they have retail. That's why they have energy. That's why they have all these people. Your industry is as welcome as any in an MBA class. So make that abundantly clear. And it's true that you don't see that many of them on this sub. I would argue that it's true they are pretty underrepresented in MBA applications. In other words, they make up, a substantial chunk of the cohort, but a relatively lower chunk of the applicants, which is good for your odds. So to be absolutely clear, yes, if you can get that GMAT, up a few points, your profile is absolutely realistic for these schools.
Okay. OP's next question then would be, my GMAT quant section is weak. However, I have an industrial engineering degree and a 96th percentile data insight score. Does the background credibly offset the quant section, or should I retake? I think you answered that.
The short answer is retake. Let me explain why. Because I don't get the feeling, honestly, that OP is going to struggle with the quant part of the program. That's not why I'm concerned by the GMAT. What I'm concerned about is, and what the schools will be concerned about, is that they have to submit this score to the rankings. The Financial Times are going to say, hey, ESA, yeah, we're just doing our ranking for this year, and we'd like to know what your class average GMAT is. And they go in and they go into their database and they find they have a really good average, except for that one person that's got a 615, and it drags down the average. And they have to say to the Financial Times, yeah, hey, sorry, we've got an average here. Unfortunately, it's been dragged down a bit by this candidate. And FT are going to say, okay, well, we're going to have to publish this ranking based on this slightly lower GMAT average, and it's going to bring you down a few points, a few places in the ranking compared to Cambridge. And obviously, that's not what the school wants. So they are looking at the GMAT score for ranking purposes. And it's the overall number that matters. The quant section is particularly important because some people it is what they use to determine whether or not you'll handle the quant part of the course, not in this case, but still the score really matters. So the short answer is the IE background does not offset the quant, does not offset the GMAT more broadly, and you should retake it if you can. Even 30 points would make a huge difference here.
Hmm. Okay. And final question for
Mm.
European programs specifically, does
Mhm.
being Mexican meaningfully help, or is that overstated?
Yeah, so I'm speaking as an Oxford grad, but have quite a lot of exposure to the other European programs as well. And basically, the difference here is between the Spanish schools versus the non-Spanish schools. The Spanish schools get a lot of applications from Spanish-speaking applicants around the world. You're in Mexico, you're thinking, oh, I'd quite like to get out of here. Where can I go without having to like study in English? Oh, there's a essay over there in Barcelona that's well ranked and I can speak Spanish. Boom, obvious place to apply. So the Spanish schools get more than their share of Mexican, Argentinian, etc. applicants, and therefore you are not really at an advantage for those programs. However, where you are at an advantage is INSEAD, right? It's not an obvious thing to say as a Mexican to be like, I want to go to France where I don't speak the language necessarily. But INSEAD, might make sense for other reasons. For example, you do speak two European languages, Spanish and English, so that you fit the boxes there, but there aren't that many other people applying. So INSEAD might be, well, it would be much more competitive there. Likewise for LBS, they really value the international experience and they pride themselves on having people from around the world, including Mexico. They don't get that many Mexican applicants because there isn't the cultural fit that there is with Spain. So there you're at an advantage. Ditto Cambridge, Bocconi to some extent, Italian, fine. Rotman, I doubt there's that many Mexicans applying to Rotman, etc. So there's a slightly nuanced difference here between the Spanish-speaking business schools, European, Spanish, Spain-based European business schools, and the non-Spain-based ones. You're at an
Mm,
advantage for the non-Spain-based ones.
okay. All right. That's all of Obi's questions.
Good.
Should we move on to the last profile for the day?
Yeah, I would say that OP might be quite a good contender for a GMAT tutor. It looks
Yeah.
like there's just the 20 points will make a difference here. One of GMAT tutors in our team, Mario, is in Latin America as well. Might be worth contacting Mario OP, and you can do that via the website, and just at least do a diagnostic and figure out like where your weakness areas are, and he'll give you some material to help strengthen those. I would say this is a pretty good case of worth a bit of money on a GMAT tutor, to be honest.
Okay. All
Cool.
right.
Good. Next profile then.
Next profile.
Short and sweet there. Look at that.
Yep. Um, some info in the title already. 25 female, 3 years at a global MNC, 326 GRE with an even split and a 3.1 GPA. OP
Mm.
is Pakistani, 3 projects scaled globally with the highest awards, 2 years startup experience in undergrad, student loans and parent deaths, which affected the GPA. OP also did some uni coaching for students. The undergrad is from a top-ranked business school. OP's question is about Yale and Kellogg, but first, just really quickly, what's your first take with this profile?
Yeah, we don't have that much information. I'm going to read between the lines a little bit, connect the
There's some
dots.
in the comments as well. If
Is
I,
there?
yeah, OP does mention what she does for the ECs. I'm working as a marketing lead pro bono for an orphanage and have been working with underprivileged kids. Yeah, to
Okay,
teach them how to do freelancing, etc.
good. Okay, so academically, 3.1 GPA, not great, but we know why. There's mention of student loans and parent deaths. So, not a train wreck here in terms of the GPA. It could be overcome. My guess if I'm understanding this right, and it's a top-ranked business school in Pakistan, it's probably LUMS, which is a
Mm,
well-regarded school. But you are going to be up against the toppers from there, the really strong LUMS graduates with sort of high 3 point something GPAs. So academically, yeah, not a train wreck, but we'll need an optional essay, and we can talk about that. The GRE of 326 is solid, balanced, around the average of the kind of M7 schools. So let's wait and see for the rest of the profile. Academically, TBD.
mm,
Professional. Now, this is where things get interesting, I think, for me. The global multinational corporation, 3 years, the right point in OP's career. MNC is a really nice industry profile, like I was talking about before. Schools are looking for this, and there's not so many applicants as there are like consultants and bankers, etc. So positive. These awards are catnip to business school. I worked with a client last year who won the P&G CEO award and got into Wharton. It's really, really nice. It screams best in class to have won these awards on these projects. So really, really nice work there. The other bit, it depends a little bit on sector from a professional standpoint. We know an MNC, but we don't know anything more than that. Some sectors lend themselves to very, very strong essays, and others it's a bit more difficult. Like the one that jumps to mind is really quite difficult to write a interesting essay about insurance, for
mm,
example. But it's a big sector. Like not to say like insurance applicants can do well, but it's difficult to write an application essay about it. In contrast, if it's healthcare, based on some sort of healthcare passion that comes from like a health issue, that's a really easy essay to write. So I would say there's a slight nuance about what kind of MNC it is here. But overall, I think it's going to be a strong point for OP's profile. From a demographic perspective, Pakistani 25-year-old female, I'd say that's pretty neutral. A lot of Pakistani applicants, not quite so many female, but yeah, fairly neutral, maybe slightly ORM. Extracurriculars. Now, this is where things get interesting for me here. The uni coaching to students is interesting. And that piece that you said there from the comments about um, working as a marketing lead pro bono for an orphanage, I suspect there's a very interesting story in there. We know about the parents' deaths during undergrad, parent/parents, I'm not sure, but parent death. There could be a very clear connection between that experience and the orphanage ECs, and maybe even the goals further down the line as well. So I get the sense there's a very, very strong story in there. Um, Goals. We don't know that much about what OP wants to do afterwards. I would say there are good goals that could work for OP and there are bad goals that could not work for OP. And the good goals would be something more or less parallel, making the most of this MNC angle. And the bad goals would be a dramatic pivot to something that's OP has no experience in, uh, you know, investment banking, because there's a lot of money in it. Those are the sorts of goals that I would want to avoid here. So TBD on goals, we don't know for sure. So my takeaway here is the stats are kind of average, but the story, I sense there's a really interesting story in there.
mhm. Okay. And do you think OP has a shot at Yale and Kellogg?
Yes.
Hmm.
Next question. We'll talk about how, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. How do you think what can OP do to improve their chances for those schools?
Yeah, I did a bit of thinking about this earlier. There's a few things. The first one is narrative based. I get the sense there's a really strong personal story connecting parents' death, orphanage, volunteering, and with some reflection, it could make some incredible leadership essays. That's one. Don't get dragged into the trap of thinking, I'm applying to business school, so I need to write a boring corporate essay when you're volunteering at an orphanage. That would be a mistake. That orphanage volunteering and this personal story there is what's making you stand out. And it could be really, really valuable. We have a kitty in the background. Hey, kitty. Next, point 2, optional essay. This is how, well, this is going to be an important part of the application. Besides using and kind of talking about the death and impact and extracurriculars, as apart from kind of building a narrative around that, you also need to use it to explicitly explain the GPA. I'm thinking an optional essay that says during, very directly what happened during undergrad. My father passed away and it affected my grades. These are the classes in particular that it affected, and you can see it on my transcripts. This is what I did to recover. This is how I emerged out of it all as a stronger person. In the optional essay, all schools offer you an optional essay, including Yale and Kellogg. So that is a really important factor. If they don't know about that context and they see a 3.1, they might be worried. But if they know that context, I'm willing to bet they might look past it. So that's improvement 2. 3, the goals. One of the things from a professional standpoint, we don't know much about OP's profile, but what we do know is they're working at a global multinational. And that is probably one of the strong points on OP's application. And so leverage that. One of the ways you can leverage that is to write about that industry in your essays. If the industry is, I don't know, squid farming, whatever, like it's a consumer goods company and the engagement is squid farming, whatever. They don't see many squid farming essays. So writing about it will be a unique essay. And therefore, if your career goals are to return to this unique industry that they don't see all the time, you get to write a unique and interesting career goals essay that they don't read all the time, and that will be beneficial. That will be really strong, beneficial for your profile. Now, the question will be from the adcoms is, you're already in squid farming. Why do you need an MBA if you're going to go back to that industry? Well, that's when you start focusing on roles that are above you, right? That are more management roles, that are more strategy-based roles where you're managing teams. Those are that. And to break into those roles, you could definitely make the case you need an MBA, particularly if you can point to a few people in your company, a few levels up, that have MBAs. Kind of thing that might come up in an interview, for example. So the third thing that OP can do to really strengthen their profile is come up with some really good goals that are along the lines of the MNC, but a little bit higher than where OP is now, and therefore need an MBA. And then get onto the research. Speak to people who've done that. Show the research. Name drop them in your essays. Name drop them in your interviews. Show you know what you're talking about to break into that role and come across as a well-researched, realistic applicant. And then the schools will look past that GPA.
Okay, that was quite comprehensive. I think that's all for OP. Shall we move on to our bonus question for today?
We can. I would just, last thing on that, I would say, OP, if you need help putting that narrative together, particularly things like drawing the line, like how personal do you get? If it's a parent death during undergrad, like that's really personal and really serious stuff. How much of that do the school want to hear? And obviously there's a bit of a balance here to strike. If you need help striking that balance from a narrative perspective, get in touch. Can definitely help with that. I think I think it'd be really important. It could be ultimately the story that gets you into business school. So seriously, take that seriously. Okay, so next profile then. Actually, no, not next profile. We're on to the bonus.
Our bonus question, and this is an interesting one. Is anyone else seeing a massive shift in what M7 schools are looking for in essays? And I know you have some thoughts on this, Sam. So the post is, I've been working on my applications for the upcoming round, and I'm getting a really weird vibe from the prompts this year compared to a few years ago. It feels like the leadership part is being overshadowed by this hyperfixation on community impact and resilience. In the past, it seemed like you could coast on a GMAT, GPA, and a clear career progression. You just explained from how you want to go from X to Y and why you need an MBA. But lately, it seems like they want a much more emotional, almost vulnerable narrative. And I'm seeing a lot more emphasis on how you failed or how you've navigated challenges. And OP is wondering how, if the traditional profile is actually becoming a disadvantage, if it's coming off as too polished or robotic, is it better to lean into the perfect professional persona, or should I be trying to find a way to weave in more personal struggle to meet this new standard? What do you think, Sam? Have you noticed this pivot?
Short answer is yes, absolutely. And OP is not imagining this. And yes, frankly, you should be looking to kind of bring a honest, vulnerable, authentic character to your application essay. Overly polished, especially if you think overly polished means like using AI to edit, like no, schools are going to prefer the more honest, authentic version. There's a couple of things like kind of some context that I'd like to like. Where's this coming from? I agree it's a thing. Where's it coming from? I've worked with now like hundreds of MBA applicants over years. So I saw the before that OP is referring to, and I saw the now that OP is referring to, and I've seen that change. And the really famous kind of case of this is HBS.
Hmm.
HBS, a couple of years ago, realized through research and whatever that they were perceived, they had a reputation as type A, and I'm going to say this carefully, assholes,
Hmm.
right? It was seen as a group of type A, ruthless, competitive assholes was the kind of summary that they took away from their brand positioning. And they've made a deliberate and concerted effort to move away from that stereotype. And particularly the way that's coming through is in terms of the people they're bringing into the class. They are
Hmm.
actively filtering out people that give that vibe, and they are actively bringing on and saying yes to people who demonstrate vulnerability and transparency and honesty in their applications, in contrast. Now, you could say that if you get a bit academic about this, you could say that the theory is that business schools are looking for leaders, especially of all places, HBS are looking for leaders, and nobody wants to follow an asshole. So, who do they want to follow? They want to follow the leader that's genuine, that's authentic, that has a few rough edges here and there, that's vulnerable, right? No one wants to get feedback from the arsehole that's never been vulnerable and taken on feedback themselves. They want to get feedback from someone who acknowledges they're not perfect themselves.
Mhm.
Leaders are vulnerable now. And so business schools like HBS, but also others, are leaning into this. The other great example is NYU Stern have added, and they've got all of their letter of recommendation template is standard, except for one question they've added in where they say, when has the applicant demonstrated EQ, emotional intelligence? Basically, as a please, what they're saying is, please, recommender, confirm to us and tell us that this applicant is emotionally intelligent and not an asshole. And so that's just two examples of schools that are really, taking this really seriously and exemplifying this shift. I think that this is getting a bit out beyond my like admissions consulting scope here, but I think this reflects a slightly broader cultural shift. I don't think sharp elbows are cool anymore. I think that in the old days of like I'm imagining these movies, these like finance films where there was
Yeah.
this super like type A, like maybe like alpha type trader on a trading floor, like and that was like the cool thing in the 80s. It's not, it's just not anymore. Like people are like, come on, chill out, mate. No one cares. Like that's
So you're not
not
the Wolf of Wall Street. Oh,
no, you're not the Wolf of
okay.
Wall Street. Exactly. Like, it's all right, mate. Take a deep breath. Like, it's fine. Like, so that's not really culturally a thing anymore. And business schools kind of reflecting that. I think that's one thing. I think another thing is that the this shift needs to be seen in the context of of more importance placed on diversity. And I know I'm stereotyping a lot here, but you could say that the more linear profile kind of narratives have historically been also overrepresented people. The classic like the classic journey that, and I'm allowed to say this because actually this was me, like the classic sort of white boy privileged investment banking kind of narrative, very polished narrative, it's fine if you want a bunch of white boys like me on your profile in your cohort. But if you're looking for diversity, then you're going to get people who've followed other life paths, creatives, like all sorts of different people. And so if you're looking for diversity, you're also going to be looking for people who have not followed this straight and narrow path that OP is talking about. So that's a function as well. And by the way, like this matters because school, apart from just the benefits of diversity, schools are getting ranked on this. So they're really, really taking it seriously. So that's another thing. And then the last point I'd say is that tech, the prominence of technology, and particularly these tech leaders. I'm thinking of Mark Zuckerberg showing up in his grey round neck t-shirt, really casual. Tech has encouraged a culture of like, we're going to judge you on what you build and what you do, and we're going to look past the suit and the ties and the polished appearances that bankers used to live off. And we're going to judge you on what you're good at and what you do. And the prominence of tech, and especially sort of the well-known big tech, has stripped away the bullshit and the polished crap and made people, I think people now, more importantly, value an honest leader that shows up in a t-shirt and is a little bit vulnerable here and there. And I think that cultural shift is being reflected in MBA applications. And I'll just end this on a personal note, which is that I'm afraid I like to, parts of this I'd like to feel like I'm moving with the times, but the other part of it is I don't think you'll have seen me doing any Reddit roasts without a collar on. This is because I had beaten into me this culture of if it's work, you wear a collar, and if it's banking, and if it's a client meeting, you wear a tie. And this was beaten into me, and I'm struggling to get into the techie t-shirt vibe. That's not my thing, but it is sort of more broadly absolutely out there and absolutely a thing.
Mhm.
And so I don't know, just a bit of cultural commentary on it, but it's definitely right, and it's definitely if you're an applicant wondering whether should I be vulnerable or should I be polished nowadays, M7 vulnerable.
Mhm. Yep. All right. Okay. That was
Amazing.
all of our profiles and a very insightful bonus as well. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, interesting, right? Cool.
Mhm.
Well, if you've enjoyed today's roast, feel free to like and subscribe, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We roast every week, week in, week out. We're on roast 59 or something now. Like we're going to keep going. If you're looking for an admissions consultant, get in touch as well. We are currently focused on round one application, so the September deadlines. But if you're looking further afield and looking at thinking about R2 or even next year, you can get in touch as well and start planning ahead. Go to samweeks.com to book a free meeting. And I think that's everything. Good luck with your MBA applications. And Mal, I'll see you next week.
See you next week, Sam.